Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first session of our Online Environment and Women's Health workshop series. This workshop series is supported by the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK, LSE's Global Health Initiative, and the British Society for Population Studies. Today's introductory session features presentations from experts in women's environmental health issues. We apologise for a last-minute change to the programme as Dr. Rochelle Burgess is no longer able to join us today, but we will still be hearing from Dr. Katie Dow from the University of Cambridge and Professor Tahseen Jafry from Glasgow Caledonian University. First, let us introduce you to our team and give you a brief overview of the ExWH project and this workshop series. My name is Dr. Laura J. Brown. I'm an ESRC postdoctoral fellow in the Department of International Development at the London School of Economics, and I've co-organised these workshops along with Dr. Elaine C. Flores, who's from the Centre of Global Mental Health, which is a joint collaboration between the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and King's College partners. We have organised these workshops with the help of our wonderful team of project assistants. These are Billy Turner, Valeria Flores, and Natalia Zuniga-Arbildo, and also the invaluable help of LSE's Global Health Initiative Events Manager, Chanel Nunez. Our ExWH project focuses on the intersection of gender, environment, and health in low and middle income countries, with a particular view to developing participatory research projects in Peru. Our hope is that together with our preliminary qualitative research study, which is currently ongoing with Peruvian stakeholders, this knowledge exchange workshop series will bring together researchers and others from the public and third sectors whose work intersects with the environment, gender, and health nexus. We want to create an environment and women's health research network where those passionate about women's environmental health issues in low and middle income countries, and particularly in Peru, can connect and collaborate on future projects. So for today's session, I just have a few housekeeping points to mention. So please note that we are recording the workshop because we'll be making some of it available at a later date, perhaps on our website or through email subscription. We'll be monitoring the chat, and anyone posting inappropriate content will be removed. Related to this, please don't share your access link via social media because that's the number one way to get people Zoom bombing the conversation. It's also advisable to close any non-essential applications you have open on your device, particularly messaging apps such as Skype. Your microphone as a participant is muted, but we do still want to hear from you because we will have a Q&A session, so please put any of your questions for the presenters into the chat function. If you experience any connection problems, we suggest try turning in your webcam off. Just to familiarise yourselves with the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom bar, the participants icon should open up a panel on the right of your screen where you're able to interact with the workshop hosts. The chat function opens up a panel where you can enter your questions or request technical support. Make sure you select to everyone so that your question is visible to everybody. As a reminder, we have English and Spanish interpretation available for this session. So if you need to use this service, there is a globe logo in the bottom panel. If you click on that, select the language that you want to hear and press mute original audio. So now over to Elaine, who's going to introduce the session format for today.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you all for coming and make time in your agenda. So today's session, we have two fantastic presenters. First, Dr. Katie Dow will be presenting reproduction, gender and environment, fertile connections. And then Professor Tahseen Jafry will be presenting gender-based violence, conflict, peace and security in the context of climate change, achieving climate justice and progressive social change. These presentations will then be followed by a session of questions and answers from you all, from the attendees. So please post your questions in the chat box, where Billy, our research assistant, will be keeping an eye on the questions coming and collating them to ask our speakers once the presentations are finished. So now we are going to Katie's talk. Well, Katie Dow is a senior research associate in the Department of Sociology at the University of Cambridge and deputy director of the Reproductive Sociology Research Group. Her main research interests include connections between reproduction and environmental concerns and how intersecting inequalities reproduce reproductive injustice. So now over to you, Katie.
Thank you very much. I think I'll just share my screen. Yeah, okay. So I just want to start by saying thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this exciting workshop. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be talking today, and I'm looking forward to the next two sessions. I also just wanted to say an extra thank you to the whole team for managing this transition in a time of transition for everyone and new challenges with technology so smoothly. It might not have seemed smooth to you, but it certainly seemed smooth to me from my point of view, and I know that takes a lot of work, so well done. I also just wanted to acknowledge at the outset, I'm not sure if she's here in the audience, but I'm going to be talking about 3 different case studies, and one of them is a project I'm working on, a collaborative project that I'm working on at the moment, which is led by Heather McMullen at Queen Mary, University of London. So I just wanted to say that at the outset, so that's clear. Okay, so intersections between reproduction and the environment are multiple, timely, and vital to the present condition and future potential of human life. In the introduction to their edited collection on queer reproduction, stratified reproduction, and reproductive justice, Marcin Smetana, who's a colleague of mine at Cambridge, Karis Thompson, and France Windance Twine call for an awareness of the environmental and interspecies embeddedness of reproduction, without which inequality, toxic exposure, and biodiversity and climate crisis will likely exacerbate the very hierarchies that support some families and not others. Social scientists have been attending to the links between reproduction and the environment as set out in a recent review by Martine Lappé, Robin Jeffries-Hein, and Hannah Landecker, which identifies the potential of an environmental reproductive justice framework for understanding how climate change affects sexual and reproductive health, social reproduction, and reproductive justice and injustice. In this talk, I'll explore how we might grasp the important yet complex connections between reproduction and the environment whilst resisting the problematic lens of overpopulation, as well as heteronormative assumptions about what fertility, reproduction, and kinship are or should be. To understand these intersections better, we need empirical research guided by methodological and analytical frameworks that work from the bottom up, that can build solidarities, help inform effective societal transformations, and which never lose sight of the power structures that drive both environmental destruction and the curtailing of reproductive rights. As you'll know, scholars and activists have shown the effects that environmental conditions can have on reproductive and neonatal health, and how these effects are indexical of broader structures of inequality in which certain people's lives and reproductive capacities are valued and encouraged more than others. And this is true in the global north as well as the global south. North American Indigenous activists and scholars have put forward environmental reproductive justice as a framework that brings together and builds on the shared approaches and insights of the environmental justice and reproductive justice movements in order to identify, understand, and address such instances of injustice. Similarly, scholars like Catherine Yusof, Heather Davis, Zoe Todd, and Vanessa Agard-Jones have shown that the links between environmental and reproductive justice and injustice have very long lineages. Our current ecological predicament is rooted in histories of exploitation and extraction of humans and natural resources in the service of capitalist and colonial expansion, which were and are just as focused on reproductive control, coercion and exploitation as they are on destruction, extraction and killing. The brutal and brutalising effect of these injustices are felt today in political, social and economic divisions and in climate change. Racism, homophobia, ableism, economic deprivation, social injustice, forced migration and exposure to toxic environments all have direct effects on people's ability to reproduce children, make kin and sustain intergenerational relationships, and thus to make and remake the worlds in which we live. For too long, the conversation about reproduction and environment has been focused on the supposed problems of overpopulation and human population growth. As Jade Sasser has suggested, limiting human population growth is an appealingly simple solution to a complex and in many ways overwhelming problem like climate change. But this supposed solution recapitulates so much of the thinking that has created climate change in the first place, from the necropolitical and eugenicist categorising of humans into lives worth living and those better off not born, to promoting individualised solutions to climate change, to targeting technocratic interventions on typically poor and marginalised women's bodies. So this afternoon I'll instead focus on some of the other ways in which people link reproduction and environmental concerns through examples from past and ongoing research, before going on to suggest another way of thinking about the fertile connections between reproduction and the environment. In doing so, I'll develop an idea I first put forward in an article in 2016 of an ecological ethic of reproduction. Before turning to my examples, I would also add that one of the important factors about the links between reproduction and environment that often gets overlooked, I think, is the symbolism of both reproduction and environment, which can be particularly fertile when brought together. Reproduction, fertility, and infertility act as important bellwethers in people's thinking about the state of the environment, and vice versa, and this will be apparent in all three of my examples. So I'm going to talk briefly about three examples or cases from my research over the last 15 years. Firstly, I'll discuss my doctoral research amongst environmentalists living in rural Scotland in the first decade of this century. I'll then discuss two projects that I'm currently working on, an ethnographic research project on seed saving and activism around seeds, which is focused on people growing food in home and community gardens in London. And as mentioned, a collaborative project led by Heather McMullen at Queen Mary on climate activists who are reconsidering whether to have children in the face of climate change. So for my PhD, this is such a typically anthropologist way to introduce this. I spent nearly 2 years in a rural coastal village in northeastern Scotland, where I spent most of my time amongst people involved in animal conservation and the environmental movement more broadly. People there were very concerned about the effects of human activity on the natural world, and because there was a resident population of bottlenose dolphins, which were regularly sighted from the village and surrounding area in which I lived, they were particularly focused on these animals and what environmental threats from deep sea fishing to pollution to climate change might mean for them and their survival. When I interviewed people there about their thoughts on human reproduction and particularly the ethics of assisted reproductive technologies, I found that they drew on ideas of nature and naturalness to help formulate their ethical positions, as well as pointing to the importance of a stable environment on future generations of any species. And as I have written, while much of the bioethical and public debate about assisted reproduction has focused on the ethics and politics of creating life in labs, and empirical research with patients has shown the ontological choreography, to use Caris Thompson's term, of creating genetic relatedness in the face of infertility, my research showed that the environment in which future generations are conceived and raised can be just as important as whether they're a genetic match with the people who bring them up. Notably, for the people I was working with in Scotland, who, as I've said, were involved in environmental campaigns and aware of the effects of human activities on species' ability to survive and reproduce, this wasn't just about the environment in an abstract sense of the surroundings in which one lives. It was also about the future, what the future might hold when we take into account environmental destruction and the looming threat of climate change. This led one person to wonder out loud in an interview whether threats to the environment would eventually translate into threats to human fertility. Would humans one day be endangered too, she wondered, and would this be an act of planetary resistance as the Earth reasserted itself against the harms that humans had subjected it to by making it impossible to produce future generations? This example is from the mid-2000s, a point at which climate change was still something that could be contested and denied in mainstream media outlets, and in which concepts like carbon footprint and ethical shopping were popularised. At the time, speculating that environmental damage might finish off humans was a relatively radical and unusual thing to say, and I must admit I'm still not sure to what extent she meant it literally, not that that necessarily matters in terms of the point she was expressing. However, in the last few years, as you'll know, climate change has experienced an extraordinary resurgence in prominence and seriousness in how it's treated in public discourse here in the UK. Interestingly, the contemporary climate movement is also preoccupied with death and extinction, including that of humans. Whilst much rhetoric focuses quite rightly on how species might be killed by climate change and its effects, we should always remember that we cannot survive without reproducing. Extinction is ultimately a reproductive failure. Over the last few years, I've been researching seed-saving practices and activism in the UK, particularly focusing on people growing food on a non-commercial basis in London. Now, people save seeds for many different reasons, from the personal to the political, and most often a mixture of the two. One big factor for many of my participants and for the seed-saving movement in general is to turn the tide of the loss of biodiversity that has gone along with industrialised agriculture, which favours uniformity, reliability and monocultures over local expertise or the value of growing multiple varieties of crops, which might not be deemed suitable for large-scale trade. For the participants in my research, this is not only about conserving particular heirloom varieties or trying to bank seeds for some future apocalypse, though both of them do have their value to them, so much as it is about conserving the relationships between plants, people, non-human animals and particular environments. This in situ seed saving has many ecological and social benefits, but I think it also expresses a value system that favours, above all, abundant diversity in all species. Conserving abundant diversity is important to seed savers, I believe, not only because of the political and ethical values that go with it, but also because this ethos expresses something about how people conceptualise relationships between seeds and their environments. Back in the 1990s, Donna Haraway said that nothing comes without its world, and I think this is one way of expressing how people think about seeds. Seed savers think of plants carrying their environments along with them as they move through generations. So it's not only that a plant is embedded in its environment, but it in fact in some ways embodies its environment. It has taken its environment inside itself. My third example comes out of this collaborative project with Heather McMullen, with members of 3 organisations led by women: Birthstrike in the UK, Conceivable Future in the USA, and No Future, No Children in Canada, all of which provide a forum for people who are so concerned about the existential threats of climate change that they are considering not having children for fear of the future those children would face. The leaders of the 3 organisations are very clear that they are neither populationist or antinatalist, though this is often how they are perceived and presented in the media. And of course, since these are quite loose organisations, there will be some who are associated with it or who've written a testimonial who will have those views. And in fact, this tension has become so acute for the leaders of Birthstrike that they have very recently decided to take a new direction with the collective, moving away from political campaigning towards forming a support network for people to discuss their concerns about raising children in the climate crisis, as you can see in this public announcement which came out in the last couple of weeks. This points to a problem of scale in the movement. These activists are talking about their most personal, intimate decision-making in order to demand systemic change. And it's worth saying that the idea that reproductive decision-making is something that can or should be deliberated in this sort of way is a sign that these activists are coming from a particular socioeconomic position, though dismissing them as privileged, while it may be true in one sense, can also detract from the point they're trying to make about how climate change is everyone's problem and that we need to hold governments and industry accountable for its effects. Research participants described their focus on reproductive decision-making as a means of sounding the alarm about the severity of climate change, as well as a way to start conversation with those who are uninterested in climate activism. For some of the people in this movement, talking about whether there is a safe future for children is also a way to express how serious the stakes of climate change are. For those who have not followed the science and the effects and don't know about the effects of global warming and biodiversity loss, whether that be politicians, journalists, or their grandparents. So in an article about my doctoral research published in 2016, I described what I called an ecological ethic of reproduction for the participants in that research who I've just mentioned. In contrast to the focus on genes, cells and clinics that seemed so common sense in relation to reproductive technologies, the people I worked with in Scotland worried about the environments in which children, however they conceived, would grow up. Similarly, the example of birthstrike activism indicates people's values and expectations around parenting. In both cases, growing up with some relationship to nature, whether through visiting community gardens and parks, growing organic food, appreciating wildlife, or simply living in a society in which people value the natural world, is a vital part of a good life. In both examples, we also get a sense that people expect that if people are cut off from nature or live amidst environmental destruction, that this will have a negative effect on them. While my second case about seeds is focused on the reproduction of plants rather than humans, here again we see not only a sense that plants are shaped by their environments, but also that humans are shaped by their interactions with plants. The common thread is a sense that people, like non-human animals and plants, are all shaped by their environments. And this is interesting because, especially with the advent of biotechnology and the rise of the gene as a fetishized icon of life and identity from the late 20th century onwards, it might be expected that people's environments would come to seem increasingly unimportant. In fact, even in biological research, there's recently been an environmental turn. Basic science in fields such as stem cells, regenerative medicine, and developmental biology is adjusting its focus out from the genetic and genomic levels to the effects of toxic exposures, maternal-fetal interactions, and epigenetic mechanisms. All this suggests an adjusting of the scope to take into account the broader context in which people grow up and live. This shifting scope raises several questions about the relationship between individuals and environments in our contemporary moment. Are individuals freestanding entities surrounded by, but ultimately separate from their environments? Or are the borders of the individual a little more porous and malleable? Are people in fact shaped by the environments at the most fundamental cellular level? Do people, plants, animals all embody their environments? And what might this mean for reproductive and environmental justice? What does it mean to think of the world as made up of individuals and their environments anyway? Of course, here I'm using environment in a broad sense, which some might think runs the risk of confusing matters, but I would suggest that having a very narrow conception of the environment is also dangerous, especially in a time of climate crisis. Here I've raised questions about the relationship between individuals and environments in relation to reproduction, parenting, and some fundamental questions about how humans and other species are constituted. Thinking about the relationship between individual and environment also has a particular valence when we take into account people's concerns about the destruction of the environment, climate change, biodiversity loss. Another thread that runs through my three examples is an understanding that climate change is not for individuals to solve. Environmental problems demand collective action and systemic change. Indeed, one of the problems that the people I worked with in Scotland in the first decade of the 21st century had was the popularity at that time of individualised responses to environmental issues such as ethical shopping, which were not coincidentally coupled with a relative lack of interest or action on environmental issues in both political and popular discourse at that time. Shifting the focus away from individuals as individuals onto their relationships with their environments is a political move. It resists the conceptualisation of people as individual consumers who go through their lives making rational choices in freedom, which is at the heart of the neoliberal ideology that also drives our reliance on fossil fuels and extractive economies. When it comes to reproduction, it also comes closer to the reproductive justice and environmental reproductive justice frameworks, which both insist on paying attention to the infrastructures that make lives possible and livable. In particular, those frameworks point out how narrow our understandings of reproduction can become if we focus only on whether and how children are conceived and not on how they're raised and what the conditions of possibility are for them. I should note a caveat here. These justice frameworks have been developed by Indigenous people and people of colour in the USA, and they come out of very specific conditions of injustice which these communities have been subjected to. And this is really important to remember, especially in relation to the examples I'm describing here, in which many, but not all, of the people and activists involved are white middle-class British people, like myself. However, although we must retain a sense of these important differences and how they can affect who gets heard and which problems are taken seriously, there are also, I think, opportunities to build solidarity. And one of the problems of conceptualising peoples as individuals, after all, is that it puts barriers in the way of collective organising. So I don't really have any conclusions, but I have some suggestions for future directions. So future research should, in my view, ask what kinds of transformations in kinship and reproduction climate crisis brings about, what future imaginaries of relationality are thinkable and possible in the context of climate crisis, and how the insights of the reproductive justice, queer justice, environmental justice, and climate justice movements can help us to understand them. In thinking through connections between reproduction and environmental concerns, we need to attend to reproductive infrastructures. These justice frameworks that I've talked about remind us that existing power inequalities drive the intersections between reproductive and environmental injustice. And so in responding to the ecological crisis, we must be careful about what ideologies and norms get reproduced along the way. As the queer ecology scholar Noel Sturgeon has pointed out, the nuclear family under capitalism is a model for environmental destruction. Some of you will have seen that some academics and activists are calling for rethinking of kinship and reproduction as a response to climate change. As well as identifying the unequal and negative effects that climate change is having on people's reproductive opportunities and capacities, researchers should, in my view, investigate ways in which people are also using the crisis point of climate change to resist and rethink norms of reproduction and kinship, not in order to supposedly reduce their carbon footprints, but to create nurturing, creative, stable environments in which all life has the possibility to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Many thanks, Katie. There are a lot of interrelated issues that we really need to think more thoroughly about there. So please, for all our attendees, remember to put any questions that you may have for Katie in the chat box, and we will try to get to them as many as possible in the question and answer session at the end. And next up, we have Tahseen. Tahseen is currently the director of Glasgow Caledonian University Centre for Climate Justice. Current research interests of Tahseen include justice and equity aspects of climate change, gender and poverty targeting, climate migration and conflict, the psychosocial impacts of climate change, and the geopolitical nature of climate justice discourse. So now over to you, Tahseen.
Thanks very much, Elaine. I just want to say before I begin, it's both an honour and an absolute pleasure to have been invited to take part in the workshop, and it's such a pity that we weren't able to do it in person down in London, because I was really looking forward to having to meet Laura and the team down there. I think you've done a brilliant job in trying to put it all together online. And it's great to see so many people taking part as well. So well done for all of that. So my presentation is probably quite different to the one that you've heard already. In fact, I'm looking at things from my experiences of working overseas, and the things that I've learned and picked up along the way. So it's quite a complex mix, mix of issues there: gender-based violence, conflict, peace, security in the context of climate change. But what does it mean for achieving a more climate just world and for progressive social change? No, why does not this? Okay. Sorry about that. So what I want to start off by saying is providing a little bit of context. So yes, our climate is changing, and according to the IPCC, earthquakes, severe flooding, tropical storms and other climate-related hazards are expected to increase further worldwide, with some regions being affected much more than others. Globally, we know that during the period of between 2000 and 2009, there were 3 times as many disasters as there were between 1980 and 1989. The World Meteorological Organization have confirmed that the past decade has been the hottest on record, and warning that the higher temperatures are expected to fuel enormous and numerous extreme weather events 2020 and beyond. So the warning signs are already out there. But according to UN Women, what does it mean for them? As climate changes, this will increase the frequency and severity of disasters and risks and challenges associated with sexual and gender-based violence, and these things will heighten. In addition to this, there will be negative impacts, particularly on women and girls. We must recognise that gender-based violence, it doesn't just affect women, but girls and women will be affected the most, and this poses significant challenges to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. In terms of our long-term vision, we need to have clear strategies for obviously reducing the violence and promoting gender equality and women's empowerment, and this has a health kind of like implication too. I just wanted to read out a quote according to Filippo Grandi, who is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Climate change and natural disasters can add to and worsen the threats that force people to flee across international borders. The interplay between climate, conflict, poverty, and persecution greatly increases the complexity of refugee emergencies. And we know that the refugee crisis is worsening because of the impacts of climate change, and this is in relation to forced displacement of people, not just within national borders, but across borders as well. So there are many, many factors at play here, and that's what makes the whole topic very, very complicated to deal with. I think my computer is a little bit, there we go. Okay, so in terms of gender-based violence and COVID-19, I think this presentation would not be apt unless we mentioned the impact that COVID-19 is playing out. 1 in 3 women worldwide experience physical and sexual violence, mostly by an intimate partner. But pre-pandemic, 243 million women and girls aged between 15 and 49 experience sexual or physical violence. And since the pandemic, violence against women and girls, especially domestic violence, has intensified. And indeed, you know, the consequences of this in terms of women's health is untimed and unwanted pregnancies, and I'm sure you must have heard a lot about this already. Sexually transmitted diseases, including HIV, pelvic pain, genital injuries, and so on, and unwanted pregnancies, and so the list goes on. But what I also wanted to mention here is the impact it's having on women's mental health. For survivors of gender-based violence, in particularly from impacts of climate disasters, include post-traumatic stress disorders, depression, anxiety, substance misuse, self-harm, and suicidal behaviour. And I'll explain further when I talk about my field visit of having witnessed this firsthand. But what I find really worrying is that a survivor of gender-based violence may face stigma and rejection from her community and her family. So what does it all mean in relation to climate justice, and where are we going with this? So climate justice recognises humanity's responsibility for the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on the poorest and the most vulnerable people in society. And by doing so, critically addressing the inequalities and promoting transformative approaches to addressing the root causes of climate change. And this is a definition that we have come up with at the Centre for Climate Justice through scouring lots and lots of literature and having this published. So that took us a while to pull together what we mean by that. But essentially what we're looking at is that it's the poorest and the most vulnerable people who have contributed little or nothing to climate change that are suffering the most, and in this context it is the poorest women, children and girls. According to the United Nations, you know, we know the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and violence against women and girls is considered a human rights violation, and from where I look at this, it's also a climate injustice, and these two things, violation of human rights and a climate injustice, are inextricably linked. So I want to try and portray some of these facts and figures and data and information that I'm presenting to you with reference to two projects. First of all, it's a project which we just started working on in Malawi, and I was out in Malawi in February just before the lockdown. And the project we're working on with the Scottish Government is on looking at the psychosocial stress of erratic rainfall and what is happening to people on the ground. And the aim of this project is to determine in terms of gender-based violence, what is happening, what are those experiences, what are the lived experiences of what's happening to women and girls, but then also to identify practical solutions that can help rebuild lives, build resilience and a future that is climate just. And the thing that underpins this is health and well-being is absolutely critical lens by which to look at this. So we're running this project together with Mzuzu University, which is in the north, and Life Concern, which is our supporting NGO partner. So what can I say about what I learned when I was out in Malawi? First of all, you can see a beautiful picture of the lake. I can tell you it took me 5 hours to reach the communities that I was wanting to reach. It was 3 hours, it was 1 hour on a road, 2 hours on a dirt track road, and 2 hours on a boat, as you can see in the middle picture here, that one there. So we were sitting in there for 2 hours trying to reach these communities. So the village that we went to visit, Charo village, so this was towards it, 2 hours down Lake Malawi, it had been affected by heavy rainfall, a landslide that had swept down the mountainside and had basically washed away people's homes. They lost everything. They lost their livelihoods, they lost the livestock, they lost the money, they lost the chairs, they lost everything. The clothes on the back is everything that they're left with. And to make matters worse, bodies were washed up, dead bodies were washed up on the shore and found in the lake as well. The floods, landslide happened at night and no one could see what was happening. What this has meant for the women that you're seeing there in these pictures, what I experienced was one of the most challenging conversations I've had having worked in development for almost 30 years, and I've worked in some of the poorest parts of the world. But these women that you can see there, they were traumatized. They were psychologically traumatized. They can't sleep at night. They have nothing to eat. They don't know how they're going to feed their families. They worry the minute a spot of rain falls in case another disaster is going to happen. They have no support. As you can see, it took me 5 hours to reach these communities. They haven't had any help. But what's sadder about this situation is that they are still trying to recover bodies that are lying under boulders of family members, and they cannot shift those boulders. From a health perspective and from sexual and from gender-based violence perspective, what I found really harrowing is the support, the little support that they did get in terms of food aid. They had to basically barter with their bodies to receive food packages so that they could feed their children. If they did not swap their bodies for sex, then they would not be able to eat that night. So they were put under extreme pressures and situations. And what some of the stories that they were telling us is that some of the farmers from some of the better off communities or people who still have their homes, people who don't have the homes, they will beat their women and children and go and share a house with somebody or a hut that's not been damaged or crumbled. They're facing extreme hardship, these women. But what I found hopeful about it all is you can see this image at the end here. I'm smiling, these women are smiling, and they had, even though they have nothing, they have a sense of hope. And I think that's what I've taken away with me from Malawi, thinking that these women are actually strong, and with a little bit of help and support, counselling and so on, they will get through this disaster. It's just that they just don't get the help that they need. It's a shame that we weren't able to collect and continue with the project because of COVID. No travel, no fieldwork has been allowed, obviously, since February. So this project is on hold just now until we can get back and continue the fieldwork and collect all the data and insight that we needed. But that gives you a sense of reality check about what's happening on this relationship between climate, health and violence. The second project I want to talk about is called Jafry, and that's this is a project that looks at gender equality in agriculture. And it was really interesting listening to Katie, because she was also talking about people growing food, and this project is about people that grow wheat in the Indo-Gangetic Plains across South Asia. This project is funded by the CGIAR, and if you look up Jafry, you'll be able to download all the information there. It was quite a long project, and my responsibility was to look after field work in 4 countries: India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Nepal. I'm just going to present to you findings that has been published from field work that was done in India. So this is from 4 Indian states, and what we were trying to do was understand a little bit more about how women deal with or address gender norms, and how that helps them with coping mechanisms with their interrelationship with in terms of gender in terms of survival, and how they portray themselves as managing a situation where women are quite often seen as helpless and worthless. So we worked in four places: Prem in Bihar, Prem and Deva in Bihar, Chida in Uttar Pradesh, and Betty in the Punjab, and Tali in Haryana. So it's a few state villages that we worked in there. So we were trying to understand and come up with a typology of women's strategies and how they deal with or strengthen their managerial decision-making power in wheat. And the important thing about wheat and climate change here is that in the Indo-Gangetic Plains, wheat is the major staple food crop for the region. With climate change, the wheat production is severely affected, and with the projections being the production of wheat will continue to go down as a staple food crop for feeding families. If there isn't enough food produced in it, remembering it's women's role to feed their families in South Asian context, if this doesn't happen and production goes down, it is the women who will suffer the most in terms of gender-based violence. So interestingly enough, we actually found, we discovered how women are transitioning out of this kind of like, as they're perceived as helpless, to the fact they actually adopt 6 different strategies to manage their situation and their environment. And I just want to mention these 6. So the first one is acquiescence. So this is in effect, it's around the fact that many women recognize that they're not actually expected to take part in decision-making powers, but they did not actually articulate any forms of resistance to doing so either. So in fact, they were actually quite comfortable with where they were. It wasn't as if they had to be front and center of decision-making. They were actually comfortable with what they were doing. Murmuring is a really interesting one, because it's expressed in kind of like rumblings of discontent or grumblings. And we usually heard that from kind of like middle-income women. This one is really quite interesting, because in a way that it tells us that they're fully aware of their powers, but of what they can and cannot do, but they deliberately don't make any changes to their lives, because I have a quote: "He will kill me if I make any changes to my norms and my behavior." So women will grumble alongside and not change the status quo, but it doesn't mean to say that they're not unhappy about the situation. This business about quiet co-performance is also quite interesting, because it's about women who are quietly supporting men in ways that do not challenge social norms. So they're not actually outwardly protesting, but they're quietly supporting men in a hidden manner. And they do that deliberately, knowing that the partners or the husbands will be able to continue with what they're doing, but they're supporting from behind the scenes. Then we have kind of like this business of active consultation, where men are kind of like are overtly recognised and state that women alongside men, that they actually state that there's not much difference between in what a man does and what a woman does. So in many cases there was this active consultation between a husband and wife, which I found really quite interesting. Although men remain the decision makers, but women, they still try to receive or seek consultation from their women as a kind of like a collaboration, you would say, between the partners. And then 5 and 6 were quite kind of like interlinked. Men decide. In this case, men were making decisions as to what women should be doing, but again there was this business of consultation in that process. But the last one was, in some communities, women were deciding what needed to be done to manage the households, but not in a very explicit way, but in a kind of like in a gentle manner, but they were still able to get the message through. So what all this told us, you know, if I was to summarize this, what we're actually seeing is that women develop a range of strategies that they carefully nuance and in which they describe as their own. And such strategies, I feel, need to be sensitively supported, but they must be left in the hands of women and men to manage themselves. The findings show that women across communities are perceiving different kinds of lives, and they're realizing different options that are available to them. So they're taking stock and they're taking control, and in a way that people don't overtly see when they go into the field. But this kind of like takes me on to the next slide, and I've only got another couple left before I close, and it's about leave no one behind. The principle of leave no one behind means that no goal is considered to be met unless it's met for everybody. And particularly goals 10 and goals 5, when we're looking at social and economic, political inclusion and the empowerment of all, really. And goal 5 is to achieve gender equality. Our fieldwork, though, has led us to perceive that, like I said earlier, women develop this range of strategies to manage their own well-being and self-worth in many cases. And like I said, such strategies need to be supported sensitively by an external researchers or development practitioners, and tread very, very carefully in these kind of like environments. So in terms of kind of like, I don't, like I said, I don't really have a conclusion as such, but few things I think I could just share with you in terms of how do we achieve progressive social change in terms of climate change, health, gender-based violence, and you know what we're dealing with here. I think the important thing is recognizing that increasing rates of sexual and gender-based violence due to climate change and COVID-19 is on the increase. We need to seek transformative ways in which to approach such issues and climate just approaches. And those approaches include, and I will just name a few things, inclusivity, but it needs to be about voice, representation and participation. And these are the 3 things that I think are absolutely vital to achieve a climate just transition. Developing practical support service provision, but with women at grassroots, is absolutely vital. There's no point in having service support provision unless it's been designed and developed deliberately with women at the heart. And finally, capacity building and enabling a wider community to be able to respond to the needs. And we are seeing some really good examples, and I just want to finish off by saying to support campaigns like Hands Off Our Girls. I don't know if you've heard of that one, but it kind of like was, it was when the First Ladies from across Africa joined this peaceful protest march against gender-based violence on the streets of Freetown in Sierra Leone, and that kind of like kicked off to this wonderful kind of like campaign that says Hands Off Our Girls. So there's a lot of positive stories out there. So like I said, it's a very complicated and changing scenario, but I think there's lots of lessons to be learned about things that are happening that are really troublesome. But at the same time, there's hope, and I think that we should take lessons from good examples of initiatives that are happening globally, and move forward with practical kind of like solutions for the future. So thanks very much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. It was a great presentation, Tahseen. Thank you so much for sharing your projects and your findings. Well, now it is time for the question and answers from from the attendees and our presenters. So I have been writing in the chat option. We will have the possibility, or if you are able to write your questions and direct it to either Katie or to Tahseen, either in English or Spanish, and we will be able to translate it. So Billy, we also have some questions that we have been writing over from the team. So maybe we can, as soon as we are waiting for the participants' questions, we can start with those.
Yeah, sure. So first, we've just got a more general question, which can be for either of you. What do you think should be prioritised in women's environmental research at the moment? And that's for Tahseen or Katie. Feel free to whoever.
Yeah, I'm happy to. In terms of priorities, I think that the biggest priority is well-being. It is about well-being, and it's about supporting women's not just physical but mental health and well-being, and enabling or creating sort of enabling environments that are supportive of the good things that are actually happening on the ground already. And I think one of the things that worries me is that women are quite often portrayed as victims, but in my experience, yes, I have seen many victims, but there's also strength, and women have lots of ideas, and are in positions and take good leadership positions as well. So I think, you know, if we are able to create this enabling environment that will support women's health, physical, mental well-being, and leadership, I think they're the things that are front and centre in my mind.
I would just add to that I think one of the things we know from the environmental movement more broadly and justice movements is that you have to think about issues like gender-based violence, but also climate change in a sort of holistic way, in a way that resists the kinds of binaries and boundaries which have got us into this mess in the first place. And also that I think that there's some really interesting, sorry about the background noise, there's some eco-terrorism going on there. I think also that there's some interesting resonances between how you might think of reproduction, parenting, social reproduction, all those kinds of values of care and nurturing, and though sort of emotional labour and all those things are also things that we should maybe apply more generally to problems like climate change. And I think that's, as I understand it personally, very much in keeping with the kind of climate justice approach as well.
So just a question from Maria Rosa Diaz. How do you associate climate change and gender violence?
Do you want me to take that?
Yeah, that was brilliant.
So I think
doesn't say it before, but yeah.
Yeah, so that was the front end of my presentation there, when we're talking about how climate is changing, and if we put it in simple terms, it's either going to be droughts or floods. You know, there'll be natural disasters and extreme weather events, and it's the onslaught of the extreme weather events such as flash floods, like I experienced out in Malawi, that is displacing people and is leaving people in very, very vulnerable situations, and they're at a point where they can be, particularly women, are left being taken advantage of. The other, in terms of, you know, from not within just their own households, but from other people bringing in food aid. But the other worrying thing about this is it is forcing people to become displaced, or women are having to walk further and longer to collect water and fuel wood. So it's a women's job and a girl's job. So the further they move from their homestead, the more at risk they are of being trafficked, and that's human trafficking, sex trafficking, and that is happening right now. It's through no fault of their own, because they've gone to collect water or fuel wood. So the evidence is clear that that's what's happening.
And we just got another question from Maria Sergio from Mexico, for Tahseen as well. What do you think are the key aspects for effectively support women-led solutions on the ground to counter climate change and gender-based violence?
In terms of key aspects, I think for me the most fundamental thing is having dialogue and conversation, and being how I would describe is sitting on the ground in the field, no matter where it is, and talking to those talking to the people who have been affected. That includes men as part of that conversation, because in my experience, if you just take women aside on their own and develop solutions with them on their own in isolation without the rest of the community, it somehow kind of like sets up for failure. It's got to be a holistic approach. So key aspects is conversation and dialogue, understanding what's needed, and really looking at things from a bottom-up perspective. There's no point in people sitting around in offices making decisions as to what's needed on the ground when it might not work for cultural reasons, for various other norms and practices that exist on the ground. So I would say that they're the absolutely fundamentals, but the task is quite big in itself.
And I've got one for Katie. How do you think government should incorporate environmental reproductive justice to the agenda in order to achieve a substantive change?
That's a big question.
Take some time to think about it.
Well, I mean, my first thought is, in contrast to Tahseen's talk about hopefulness, is thinking about this current government and how they might respond to an environmental reproductive justice framework, which I don't hold out a lot of hope for. But I think, on the other hand, to be more hopeful, I said I was a pessimist and a cynic earlier before we started, so I'm trying not to do that too much. I think that we do, as many people have said, we do have a moment of reflection sort of globally at the moment, with the pandemic, and also with campaigns for racial justice, which are of course asking for many of the same kind of systemic changes that will also have positive effects on the environment and reproductive justice. And that's no coincidence, because of course environmental reproductive justice and those other movements are all very much informed by racial justice and civil rights, and Indigenous scholars in particular with environmental reproductive justice. So I think that the key lessons are that we need to think about how climate change and all environmental problems are indeed going to become everyone's problem, but they're also very unevenly distributed, and that's not necessarily a coincidence, that they massively intersect with existing inequalities, and that actually this has very long lineages, and that's precisely why it's very difficult to try and bring this kind of framework into focus, whilst at the same time also, there's so much rhetoric which, in many ways makes a lot of sense at the moment about how we only have 10 years left to sort of steer the ship around. And I think there's a difficulty at the moment in the environmental movement, certainly in the UK, in terms of sounding the alarm and making people realise what's going on and why, which is extremely important and vital, without also making people feel hopeless. And actually, if I can just sort of segue and ask a question myself, I was thinking when Tahseen was talking about, there's obviously so many differences between the cases we're talking about, but I was thinking about when you described the psychological trauma of the women in the first project, and whether and how we can kind of relate that or create sort of dialogue or solidarity with people in places like the UK who are experiencing a kind of anticipated grief and trauma about what will happen if we don't arrest climate change. And this, there's this term eco-anxiety, which is very much in danger of becoming, something, a stick that right-wing people beat up environmentalists with, but I think is also a really interesting one because it's trying to express something about what the future might look like, which is precisely what the sort of birth strike movement is trying to do as well. And yeah, so I just wondered, what your thoughts are about the similarities and differences, and the sort of whether it's possible or appropriate to make any connections between these different kinds of cases.
Katie, is that to me?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
No, as you were saying that, I mean, what we're experiencing here, I mean, from a climate change and climate justice perspective, I mean, we have moved quite rapidly from this narrative that that injustice is affecting the poorest and the most vulnerable people in the global south. It is about the poorest and the most vulnerable people all over the world, whether it's in the north. It doesn't matter where it is, and this kind of like similarities and what lessons we can learn between different case studies. I was hearing about there's a pretty sad story about, it was in northern England, where a couple in the 80s were found standing on a bridge after severe flooding, where they had lost everything in their homes, all their worldly possessions, their photographs and everything, and they were about to jump off the bridge and commit suicide, and that's in northern England. And that is pretty traumatic, as well as it is the case studies that I'm presenting in Malawi. I think the underlying issues are there. It is affecting people psychologically in many, many different ways, and we don't currently understand enough about what is actually happening. And this term eco-anxiety, I get that term, but I think we need to kind of like simplify the language a little bit more, because if we head down a route where we're talking about eco-anxiety, we're going to frighten communities, we're going to frighten our society, we're going to frighten our young people that this is what we're up against. And I've experienced that in the Arctic, where I was hearing stories about mothers who are afraid for their unborn children because they're losing their livelihoods, they're losing their way of life in the Arctic, because they rely on reindeer herding and fishing and so on. So the Sami Council are working away on this, but I've heard these stories myself. So it's everywhere, and I think in terms of research, we really need to get to grips with understanding the baseline, and making some cross comparisons across nation states to look at what is actually what the underlying issues are, because there's very little known about this. And like I said, this example in Malawi, we were working with the Ministry of Health, who are redeveloping their health plans, but this bit they state very clearly is they have very little data and information and insight on what's happening in this context.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a few more questions that have come up in the chat. So from Leah Kenny to Tahseen, and she's in the UK. When thinking about women's well-being and climate change, are there specific areas that we should be collecting data on or measuring that are currently missing?
Well, I think it's in terms of it's how would I describe it? It's not just about the physical, but it's about the mental well-being, and also it overlaps not just the psychology, but it's a social aspect. It's about attitudes, it's about behaviours, it's about opinions, it's about what people are actually thinking about these things. So it straddles across the social sciences and psychology and health. You've got these three things that are over kind of like lapping with each other, and in the middle there we need to come up with a list of indicators or key performance indicators, things that we want to look at to measure to really understand what's happening with women's well-being. But I think it needs to happen, you know, in kind of like short, medium and long term, because this is not just about women, it's about the children and so on, and what's happening in the families and livelihoods and so on. And it is, if I just share with you just one other example, I sit on, well, we're doing some research on green infrastructure in Glasgow. So my PhD student has been looking into this, and Glasgow is very, very keen on greening the environment. And so, to cut a long story short, you know, it's about planting trees in certain areas in some of the poorest pockets in Glasgow, because everyone thinks it's a great idea, and why would people not love trees, which is great. However, the trees that are planted in place X, and I won't say what it is and by whom, that had a very, very negative effect. Basically, the women felt unsafe. It led to drug abuse, alcohol abuse, vandalism. The places were left unlit, and women did not want to send the children out to play. So when we're talking about climate change and justice, you know, these are the particular pockets where Glasgow is getting warmer. People need to keep their homes cooler in the summer. We know that, we understand that. We're trying to get, you know, to get our get green infrastructure up, but we need to get it right. And if it's not done in consultation with people, then it doesn't work. And that's kind of like my bottom line is we need to really work with our communities and understand what we want to do and measure and why we want to do that, rather than coming up with just our own ideas.
Thank you. So just following on from that, and this can be directed at either of you, both of your research approaches are qualitative in nature. What, if anything, do you think is the role of quantitative research in addressing women's environmental health issues? Either of you can take that, but whoever. Do you
want to take that, Katie, and I'll follow?
Sure. I think there's definitely a role for it, like with anything. I mean, I wouldn't know how to go about it because I'm trained as an anthropologist, but certainly, I mean, it's really important in terms of getting at the empirical realities. But it's also, you know, numbers are often what talks when it comes to informing policy and government. And, you know, I briefly worked in the UK Parliament myself, and I have a sense of what politicians find interesting, and it is about, you know, numbers and clear sort of things, and they don't, you know, obviously numbers can mean lots of different things, but they can be made to mean certain things as well, and I think that's where they become useful in terms of sort of making arguments and you know, to go back to your question also about how you might put in place an environmental reproductive justice framework to policymakers or government. I think that's where quantitative research becomes really, really important and useful.
Yeah, and I think that's underpinned by using statistical packages, you know, statistics for social sciences, and when you are a lot of research is qual, because that provides the richness and the context and the real life lived experiences of what we're trying to portray, but at the same time is developing a methodology not just to collect qual but quant data that can be transferred into, you know, statistical packages that are representative of you know, the facts and figures that we're trying to put. And in fact, that's what we did in Genovate. That was a both a qual and a quant study.
Thank you. We've got a question in the chat from Rodi Rosales from Guatemala City. That they haven't quite understood the way in which the climate change affects reproductive health. So could you explain a little bit more about that? And again, I think that could be for either of you, but maybe Katie, if you wanted to start.
Sure, yeah. Well, I think it's in lots of different ways and in lots of different contexts and perhaps surprising ways. There are some sort of, I don't know if this is the right word to use, but more obvious ways, like, for example, some of the examples that Tahseen was talking about in terms of the results of sexual violence, you know, in situations of forced migration and so on. But there's also, at the other end of the scale, for example, at the European Society for Human Reproduction and Embryology last year, scientists were presenting research showing that air pollution has a negative effect on ovarian reserve, which is, so that means that it's quite likely that we need to be thinking about how climate change and its effects and drivers, which include things like air pollution, might affect fertility levels in all parts of the world, because obviously air pollution is a really important problem in, across the world, and a growing one. It's also, there are also, as well as these sort of more kind of practical on the ground effects, that it's also very much related in how people think about the world and the future, in my experience. And this is something I'm particularly interested in my research, is the kind of symbolic and you could say metaphorical, but I think it's more than that, relationship between the environment and reproduction. So often when people think and talk about the future, and you see this particularly in the activism around climate at the moment, people will talk about the effects of climate change on future generations. And so people often mobilise ideas about reproduction, children, kinship, family, as a way of expressing their fears about the future. And this is really encapsulated in the example of birth strike. So those are just some of the examples, but I'm sure Tahseen has many more.
It's probably too many to talk about, but just in a simple sense, it is just about the vulnerability that women and girls find themselves in, and particularly young girls as well. And I think that's where the issue around reproductive health kind of like comes in. The business about unwanted pregnancies and sexually transmitted diseases, and it has a knock-on effect, not just for the very, very young girls, but also the children that they produce, and the cycle kind of like continues. And I think that's a problem, that it's very hard to see how to break that vicious cycle, knowing that our climate is going to get worse. We've all, the warning signs are all there, and particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, they are going to experience severe droughts and erratic rainfall, and that in itself sets the snowball rolling. But unless there is, like I talked about, progressive social change, for me, at the Centre for Climate Justice, what we're all about is putting these difficult, personal and challenging conversations front and centre, in front of policymakers and decision makers who need to hear the real life stories about individuals. And that's what's critical here. It's about every life matters. It's about that man, that woman and that child. It's about everybody, because everyone is affected in some way. So we need to embrace these issues and keep talking about them and raising them, so that at some point people will put energy behind it and say, this situation is just going to get worse if we don't deal with it now.
And so, Tahseen, I think this leads on quite well to a question in the chat from Alejandra, who asks whether there's been any documentation of birth strike among women in settings where the effects of climate change are more extreme, such as those in Malawi.
I think where you would get that data is with the WHO, and I think the World Bank also has some of this data, but also look at UN Women. There's a lot of work on these things just now. So international agencies are looking at it, and I think from my perspective, I've had two kind of like careers. I've worked as a practitioner in development aid, and I still do now. And my second career has been in academia. And I think the thing that underpins the headlines that come out of World Bank and UN and so on, it has to be supported by fundamental research. And that kind of like, that's how they get those facts and figures and data. So the need to push and develop research in these particular areas is absolutely vital.
Okay, we've got a couple more questions. We've got one from Jacqueline, which I think is maybe again to Tahseen. You briefly talked about engaging men in the conversation. And what do you see the role of men, including male community leaders, in supporting women's rights and climate change on women's rights in the developing South? And how should men be engaged in this process and climate justice?
Yeah, that's a massive question. it's and how does one answer that? And I personally believe that men are part of the conversation because they are the problem in its entirety. In terms of how you address that, and I completely understand that you have leaders, you have community leaders, and you have it happens in all of these different environments. It's a case of it's a case of looking at entry points. That's what this is about. It's finding sensitive inroads to entry points to conversations. That's how it needs to happen. There's no point, because when I was out in Malawi, I was sitting with women and the men were sitting by themselves, and that I fully respect was done in relation to the cultural norms of that environment, and we have to kind of like respect that. And at some point there will be this kind of like crossover in conversation between what people are thinking on one side of the camp and what women are thinking on the other side of the camp, and bringing these two kind of like conversations together. That's where the challenge is, because that's where they need to kind of like connect, and you need to find the kind of like the wriggle room, I would say, or the flexibility to win one camp over the other. Do you see what I mean? And it's coming up with that complex kind of like vision, and it's almost like creating this kind of like a future vision for where you want to see, or where the community see themselves in the next month or 6 months or a year. It's kind of like creating that kind of like vision for the whole community, and that needs to be done together. Because again, I've worked in rural Pakistan, where I've been in situations where the men have clearly told us that they don't want their women to have access to even agricultural support or food or improved seeds or anything like that, whereas the women in the same community will tell us that they want all of these things. So you're left in a very kind of like difficult kind of like situation. But that's what makes development not just hard, but I think it's challenging, but also exciting to try and find those ways forward, but doing it sensitively.
Thank you, Tahseen. So we've got one last one from Rebecca in Cambridge, which is directed to Katie. So you expressed that an excessive focus on population growth is tied to forces fueling neoliberalism. How do you think we should or shouldn't address overpopulation?
I'm tempted to recommend, well, no, I'm not tempted to, I will recommend a panel discussion that I think Laura hosted earlier in the year, and which was a really interesting discussion, which you can find, I think, on the LSE podcasts, about precisely this question. But I would say there's lots of things that are wrong with the focus on supposed overpopulation, and there's lots and lots of scholarship on this already, and so I would recommend people look at work by Michelle Murphy, Betsy Hartman, Jade Sasser, and people they reference. For me, I think that we need to pay attention to the fact that population and population growth has become mobilised in the current climate debate, and who it's being mobilised by, and in doing so, we need to be very attentive to the legacies of ideas about population and where they come from, because they don't come from a great place, and they also have a legacy of massive violence, particularly against women in the Global South and poor women, and you'll probably all know the links between the sort of population argument or movement and eugenics. So I think why it's become appealing now is because it appears to be a simple solution to climate change. And the problem with climate change, as I've mentioned, is that it's a really hard problem which demands massive systemic change. And so something that seems simple and easy is very attractive. But you only really have to think for a minute about what kind of framework you have to have about people, marginalised people in the global south, women in general, to think that some form of population control is easy or simple. That's it completely goes against the sort of principles of reproductive justice, which are about enabling worlds in which people can have or not have children in safe and nurturing environments, and that is a sort of fundamental right in the context of massive inequality, which is often practiced through forms of population control, which, you know, can be covert or overt. So it might be, you know, coercive sterilisation campaigns of the past, but it might also be about schemes that are that do things like, you know, women of a certain socioeconomic background are encouraged to have long-acting reversible contraceptives, you know, and they're targeted precisely because of the kind of demographic that they represent. So I think that's why you have to be really careful about it, but also because I just don't think it really represents people's the complexity of how reproduction and the environment actually are connected in people's lives. And I think it detracts from all the other issues and problems that people are actually facing.
Great, thank you. And the podcast that you mentioned, there's a link in the chat, so if anyone wants to check that out, you can find that there. Okay, we'll just do one last really quick question to end on. If this is for both of you. So if either of you have any ideas around how everyday women, or indeed today's participants, for example, can help improve environmental health for vulnerable women, what is the one thing we could do today to help? So maybe if you just say one thing each to finish on, that'd be brilliant. You'd like to start?
What is the one thing you can do? I think the most important thing anyone can do is it's kind of like not just for yourself but for everybody else around, and that is to no matter which country you're from, taking part in this call is to kind of like be a role model. And I think that's absolutely vital, because being exceptional role models and believing in what you're doing will stand you in good stead, not just for yourself, but for the people around you as well. And being, you know, kind of like being proud of what you believe in and sharing those things.
I think it's really difficult to choose one thing, but what springs to mind, excuse me, and which I think probably also comes out of some of the discussions we've had already, is to listen to people. I was going to say to talk to people, but actually I think listening to people and hearing their experiences and their concerns and treating them with respect and attention and seriousness and empathy is actually really important.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you both to Katie and Tahseen. And now I'm going to pass you back over to our host, Laura, just to finish off the session with a few words.
Laura, could I just come in? Just
go on quickly.
30 seconds here. I just want to say I'd like to pay a huge tribute to my friend and colleague Paula Cantor, who worked on the Generate project with us. Paula was sadly shot by gunfire by the Taliban in Kabul while she was working on this project with me. So I just pay my respects to Paula Cantor.
Thank you. Yes, I just want to say a really big thank you to both Katie and Tahseen for some really interesting points, really thought-provoking presentations. And thank you so much to the team for helping to run this event. And lastly, of course, thank you to all our wonderful participants and your insightful kind of comments and questions, which have helped to make today's discussion lively and engaging. I'd just like to remind you that this is a series, so we have 2 more workshops taking place on consecutive Thursday evenings. So our next one, which has a maternal and reproductive health focus, will be taking place next Thursday at the same time, and it will have a great mix of short presentations followed by interactive breakout group discussions. And you can find more information on our upcoming workshops at the links below. So yes, just want to say thank you everybody. It was really, really great. Thanks so much.